Dr. Tony McNeil and Dr. Alisha Jones.
Holmes Seminary. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Davis, for your logistical plan. And then they always say, you know, when you enter into someone's house, in this case, the music ministry here at Mississippi Boulevard, I have to have the good manners I was given and just acknowledge Dr. Leo Davis, who in many ways is a pastoral presence to us music ministers. And to my collaborator, Dr. Tony McNeil, who consistently puts me on. I praise God for you. And to my fellow seminarian, Reverend Dr. J. Lawrence Turner, who, yes, I went to Yale Divinity School with him, and I'm so honored to be in this house where he is the under shepherd. And to this wonderful choir, it was so great to hear you all. Let's give them a nice hand clap of praise. And I understand it's a collaboration among congregations, which is a wonderful thing to behold as well. And so I also want to acknowledge Reverend Calvin Skinner, who is taking footage. This is my fiance, and who I'm well pleased. He drove here, even when he wasn't feeling well. Jesus, if somebody got chicken noodle soup, please pass it to him, Lord. But I thank you for making it here. So I'm going to do as I was told I could do, which is a little bit of conversation and interacting with the musicians in the midst. And I see musicians throughout. And in the Black church tradition, there are ways that we make music even when we don't think we are musical. I want to clue you in onto what just happened here. As a fellow music minister, we were doing a little bit of performance practice, is what we call it as musicians, where there are things that are customarily done that are not written on the paper. Amen? There are ways that we present the material that our elders or even present congregants still do in their homes as they are worshiping God, but it reminds us of our tradition. And one of the ways in which I personally encountered that song, that congregational song, was, do you all know Jericho City of Praise in Washington, D.C.? It's a large congregation. Well, I knew Jericho before it was Jericho City of Praise. And we did something like this during a summer revival where their church came to Miracle Faith Center, my parents' church. And what they did was they came down the aisles in their robes, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? The procession, right? They came down the aisles in their robes, and the arms of their robes had those little panels where you saw colors, just all the colors. And they walked in and they gave you a little elbow as they came down. They didn't look left or right. They were focused and pressed toward the mark. And I remember that at like 8 years old. And I was like, I got to be in the choir to do this. They had their Bible or their purse on their arms somehow, but they got those arms up. And everyone was tightly walking down that aisle. Amen? But those sorts of traditions, and we talked about navigating these things, and we know we have a lot of space, and I hope that our conversation tonight will prompt us to pull some of this stuff back out and explore a little bit. So let me just tell you a little bit of how I come to this conversation. As was mentioned, I am a PK, as they call it, from the Word of Faith tradition. Amen. I see a PK over there. All right. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. PKs are preacher's kids. And I'm a part of, what we often don't talk about in divinity schools, the charismatic Christian movement. You remember Reverend Dr. Casey Price. Frederick Casey Price. Well, I was raised under that televangelistic sort of thing. But my mother was holiness, raised holiness, and my dad was raised AMAZ. So when we got good religion and folks from North Carolina came up, there was a shifting in what we did in the worship. But growing up, every time we got ready for service, I listened to the broadcast for Ever Increasing Faith. Did y'all get that down here? Evidence, dun, 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 evidence. Dun, dun. Does your life show enough evidence? Evidence, dun, 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 evidence. What does your life say? Well, that was the theme song to Reverend Price's show. At any rate, while I was raised in that sort of congregation, we were a multilingual congregation in the nation's capital. And there I had a sense of how music and music ministry could be a form of cultural ambassadorship. How it could allow us to go into the world. And so I decided to go on to conservatory to study Western European art music. However, the sort of training that I received in high school at Duke Ellington School of the Arts in DC, they kind of spoiled us because they made us think that our music was just as good as all other musics. And so when I went to conservatory, I noticed that there was this sort of hierarchy that I was unaccustomed to. And my desire to be an excellent music minister had to be negotiated in that sort of curriculum, right? Have you experienced that sort of negotiation? And so it is a complete honor to be called back into community and for folks to, I hope, see traces of culture bearing in what I do. Because I find in my capacity in the academy, I want folks to have the language to translate, not diminish, but translate our cultural heritage as we spread the gospel and as we mingle and co-create in various settings. And so, as you all know, the title of what I'm supposed to be addressing tonight is Just Worship, Liturgy that Builds Community. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and like the Pentecostal adjacent person I am, it's okay if you speak back to me in this lecture. Thank you. That's what I'm talking about right there. That's it. So I want to start off with this question. If we were to telescope into the through line of the music in your churches, what story is your community telling us about how to develop our just moral compass or our character? If we took out the sermon, what does the music on its own tell us about developing character, about justice, about our moral compass in our congregations? I said that there because last year we observed in 2019 the commemoration of 400 years where Africans arrived to the British colonies, to these shores, as a part of the transatlantic slave trade. And what I'm observing as a scholar of musics of the African diaspora is that they carried with them a technology. They carried with them oral transmission of music. And with that oral transmission of music, a lot of information was encoded on their person, on their psyche. This is important because often in settings where we are asked to shed who we are in order to assimilate, we often don't get the verbiage to understand the riches and resources within. And so I want to do a quick exercise with you to prove that the oral transmission, the oral tradition was a technology. There's an exercise that I do where I talk about how the rhythm alone, I could just clap for you a rhythm, and I bet you could download a lot of information to enter into music making with me. Are y'all ready? Y'all ready? Now I know the choir, I hope y'all are on my side. Y'all on my side? Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. All right, so I'm gonna clap a rhythm, and as soon as you know it, you can clap it with me, or if you're really bold, say what it is. Can we do that? All right, let's see.
We will rock you.
Say it again.
We will rock you.
Yeah, say it, sing it. Come on. We will rock you. One more time. We will rock you. Great. This is a beautiful Black church gesture, which means stop. So, we did that, but I'm sure some of you want to adjust that rhythm. How might you adjust that rhythm? How might you perform that differently instead of pat, clap? How might you do that differently? Go ahead and do it. Go ahead. 1, 2, ready, and. Let's sing it. We will rock you. We will rock you. Awesome. So right there alone, you know, when people diminish our musical traditions because of how percussion heavy they are, right there, you were able to tell me a lot of information. You gave me melody. I just gave you a rhythm. But y'all knew for a certainty what the melody was. You also were able to jump in and participate. Then you told me something about the quality of the rhythm. You said, okay, this resembles what it's like, but actually, you're supposed to stomp it, right? So you knew something about the quality of the rhythm. That's a technology. Data was downloaded through oral transmission, right? Then through cultural formation. In this setting, we knew that participation was key, that it was a participatory performance, and that people were to join in. You're not supposed to just observe what I'm doing detached, but the boundary is erased. Did that make sense, what I just said there? So oral music, yes sir, oral music is a technology. Say that with me. Oral music is a technology. I want y'all to think about that. The next time someone says, oh, you just learned that by rote. How many organists, Dr. Davis, do you know can hear the melody and play it immediately with all the textures like you do every Sunday, every week? Like, truly, is that a skill set that is brought into the conservatory? No, sir. No, sir. However, how are folks able to be employable in particularly Black churches without this, right? Being able to teach by ear. And so through this technology, meaning is carried. Our memories are carried. Reverence, pride, nationalism, disdain, instruction. There's even ways in which power is transferred through the music that we share. I want us to think a little bit more about genre. We already started off today with, we've come this far by faith. We call this a congregational song, right? A congregational song. And it's supposed to denote the entirety of the folks gathered in the sanctuary participating. I want to turn to another piece by John P. Key. And I want to use this as an illustration of how in worship, one of the things that we ought to consider, I think, that resists this idea of Black music or Black sacred music as commodity. Black sacred music, our worship as commodity, is thinking about the functions of our music. So let's do this John B. Key piece. I heard you earlier. Bring it.
Come on, you guys, those hands.
I am a magic now.
credo, all right, from North Carolina, our credo. I believe. Right here, I think it's interesting as we gather in community and as music ministers to be mindful of regionalisms, to be mindful that as we think of Black sacred music, and especially as we have people coming from all over the world, but particularly what we need in the cultural preservation of our musics and Black sacred worship is the distinctions along geographical lines. I knew that as we met planning for this event, one of the things that I thought was important was something that represented Dr. McNeil's heritage in North Carolina. And though we had some layers here, some acoustic instrumentation as well as electronic instrumentation, you'll notice that in a traditional sense, the beat track is reminiscent of what we might hear in a church with a wooden floorboard, right? And that body percussion, yes, that body percussion is an essential layer to this song, isn't it? That's a part of the performance. You don't do this song on carpeted floors. You don't do this. It would be performance incompetence. If you are in a church with carpeted floors, you better find a ridge, a hallway, or something for that texture. But regionalisms, as we think of Black sacred music and we gather people, one of the things that we can do to worship justly is poll the people in the congregation and see where the geographical flows come from, right? We did a similar workshop in Chicago, and it was amazing to ask people of the sacred musics of their youth. Even the elders being able to share the music that they carried with them. And so I want to pause here, and this is the conversational piece, and ask you, what genres of music, what styles of music did you grow up with? We started off with We've Come This Far by Faith. That was a striking moment for me as a child, and many of us know that song, but any genres that you all know? Yes. You know, I recall, thank you, that was the initial one I thought of, and I'm glad you brought it up. Dr. Watts' hymns and lining out of hymns, right? I remember I began to do, she said, and she looked me right in my face, and she started to cry. She started to cry because she had tried to transmit this information. And her children laughed at her. And she lightweight got triggered, but I did it. She lost herself. And she said, and she kept going, and I knew not to touch it. She went in and she led us, and she came to me afterwards. She was like, Doc, I'm so sorry. But my children, they would laugh at me, and she said, I thought you were going to make fun of it. And I said, no, ma'am. She said, but that's my music. That's my music. And so if we understand this as a technology, if we understand that data is being given to us through the practice of this music, and I'm not just talking about the lyrical stuff or the I'm talking about real world grit, real world mother wit. If we understand this as a technology, we need to be seeking out people in the congregation. We need to be talking to people in the choirs. We need to be getting the pastors-by for this technology. Do you hear what I'm saying? Do you hear what I'm saying? Because when she sang it, I've heard her sing solos before, and I've heard her sing, we love you, Lord. Oh, we love, but when she did, nothing wrong with versatility. And again, there's nothing wrong with versatility. I remember a professor, the late Dr. Wendell Logan, he would always just drop one-liners, just sage wisdom as we would be out and about. And he said something to me. He said, the best lesson I ever had was after I did some jazz artists. Let's say Coltrane. It might not have been Coltrane, but go with me. And he said, after I played it, my trumpet teacher, who was also black, he looked at me and he said, he started crying. He said, I learned their music, but I never learned my own. And in this black sacred music day and age where worship is a commodity, we sell our worship. What other faiths sell their worship? And y'all know, gospel music is on the rise in the industry. People are investing right now. We know this. We are seeing a lot of the deals that are happening right now. And so, it's interesting to see how black sacred music as a commodity and the ways in which it's being studied. The culture bearers are not the youth. It is actually falling flat with the elders. So these intergenerational conversations are important. I want to also ask, are there any other genres anyone wants to lift up that we may not know of? I know people mention Negro spirituals. That is the correct term. They are Negro spirituals, not Appalachian spirituals. They are Negro spirituals, not African American spirituals, because if you look them up in the library, they are under Negro spiritual. So be strong. It's Negro. It is Negro. It is Negro. Just Negro. Trust me. All the anthologies that you want to listen to, it's Negro spiritual. There are Negro spirituals, hymns, anthems, any other musics that we want to lift up that you recall? Any out here?
What about gospel jazz?
Yeah. Yo, I feel like we are one in the spirit. I was thinking jazz vespers, Reverend Dr. Dwight Andrews. So many people have done excellent jazz. Duke Ellington's Sacred Concert, right? Wow, yeah. Anyone else? Thank you. Anyone else want to lift up any sacred music? You raise your hand. Oh, praise the Lord. Amen. Amen. The reason why I'm lifting this up is because going back and drawing in these sort of tastes and preferences help people to connect through memory, through nostalgia. There's data in it, but there's also ways of feeling as though they are getting engrafted into community. Okay, so we address the ideas surrounding genre. We address the ideas surrounding the function, the congregational music. This was also, the song we just did was Call and Response, which is very important for the organization of community, where you have the soloist who sets the pace, sets the tone literally, and then through their signature sound, they're able to interact with the crowd. In concert music, it's often referred to as antiphony, but the same thing happens in concert music. We just call it call and response here. But that call and response is an opportunity for us to give our identity as a musical congregation. And then the levels of participation. There is a critique right now in the popular discourse around sacred music that we have grown passive in our worship, where we want to be presented to. And for music ministers, as people who have been entrusted with setting the atmosphere, as people who, as Donald Lawrence says, readily access the presence of God, we have to make sure that people are leaving with the presence as they leave this place. And I'm not saying, the bark approach or the Simon Says approach, lift your hands up, lift your hands up. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is these resources, through earnest, spirit-led versatility, are essential to setting the atmosphere for God's people. Channeling what you know in terms of their memory, their regionalisms, what reminds them of home and where they met God. Taking a survey like that, what was the music of the place that you met God? That can be a powerful experience to incorporate into our worship. And there can be parts in which you are contemplative, where you allow another person to demonstrate their skill set. But I encourage you as pastors, as seminarians, as believers and seekers, that the more people are compelled and inspired to tap into the worship, the more people will be able to readily access the presence of God. I want to move to this next piece. And here's a moment of challenge that I offer to you all. It's a beautiful piece, Guide My Feet. And where the first piece I envision as a sort of invocation, and it gives us the sense of why we gather, we come this far by faith, I believe is a sort of North Carolinian credo, if you will, in the tradition of rural and remote North Carolina, Black North Carolina. This song is a song of commission to me. It is a song of to the minister and to the believer ambassador alike. However, there's also a way in which we can push the usage of a song like this. Dr. McNeil? so here I kind of forewarned Dr. Davis and Dr. McNeil's going to push it just a little bit here, and I hope they trust me because, so we have fixtures within our worship, regardless of denomination, culture, etc., right? And so now, as we think of just worship, we have to think about equity, fairness, and bringing people from the margins into the center, okay? So whether it is the seeker, whether it is a person who speaks a different language, a foreigner, if it's a person of a different culture, a different faith tradition, how might we, and I'll use this in a positive sense, how might we conspire to design worship to bring people from the margin to the center? And as I was thinking about what constituted our song selection, I saw this one, and I'm sure Dr. McNeil knows where I'm going to go with this. I saw this selection, and I thought, and we call this a type of listening. As I think of fairness, justice, mindfulness, equity, this is what justice is. How might a person who describes himself as disabled, a person who might be a veteran, an amputee, how might they deal with the imagery of feet in worship? And I'm not saying do away with the song, but our task as liturgists, as people creating the work of worship, people who are working in concert with preachers and dancers, and we got entire shows in church, right? How do we converse in the repertoire? So how do we then respond to this imagery is biblical, right? It is biblical imagery. But a person living with the realness of no longer having their feet or never having had their feet, how do we then bring them into the conversation, in the worship? Does that make sense, what I'm asking here? Does that make sense? So this might be a moment where Dr. Davis looks out and he knows this is scheduled. And he's thought through this repertoire, and there's a conversation with this song where they are not left in their ability or disability, because that becomes a sonic distraction. Over and above the sermon, over and above what the ushers do, over and above the greeting and the passing of the peace. So how do we, and that's not the only moment, but imagery, as we think of imagery and we plan, we can do types of listening. So disability is one, and there are those who say differently abled, and a lot of people of color who describe themselves as disabled have accepted that term, so I'm using what people I'm in conversation with use. Even the idea of gender in worship. I know that we are accustomed to God as He, and that's fine. But the nurturing God, though, what will that do for the masculinity that we have around us, to know of a nurturing God? And the femininity around us, to talk about the many-breasted one, right? The comforter, right? Wisdom. These are womanly attributes. How might we temper aspects of the worship for the women in here who need to understand about what to do with that nurture, right? So just thinking through the prisms of identity, of race. You know, I get so many questions with non-Black congregations that say, we want to do Black music, we want to do Lift Every Voice and Sing, for example, but we don't know how to do it, right? Well, when you're thinking about identity, you bring in a person who is disabled to give you an inventory of your repertoire. And they are invited in as consultants, so compensation. They are invited in for their knowledge, and they take inventory of your worship and how they might hear your ministry. What if we did that? What if we had people who sign language? did sign language, and they came in and they told us how they could be present in a sonically heavy worship. One of the examples I love to give is at Metropolitan. Was it the doxology or the Lord's Prayer? Doxology. I had snuck into Metropolitan Baptist Church to support, I think, Reverend Nolan Williams. And if you know anything about the historic Metropolitan Baptist Church, it was near Gallaudet University. Do y'all know about Gallaudet University? Gallaudet University is a university for people who do not hear, okay? And so on staff at that church, they've always had at least 2 sign language interpreters, at least 2. And they would interpret side by side or on either side of the platform. And that Sunday, I recall a moment in which the lights were dimmed and all there was the organ. And they began to play the doxology, and the people gathered only signed it. It was not sung, they just signed it. And I thought that was an awesome moment of solidarity with those who might be students or professionals who lingered from Gallaudet University. And so collaboration in those ways, taking inventory, and not all at once, but as you as a congregation grow and as your sermons develop in the congregation, offering up, aiding the music minister, because the music minister can't do it all by himself. Can I get an amen? But being investigators about that love that we're supposed to be known by, that hospitality we're supposed to be known by, and helping to build up the repertoire through our listening. There are also ways, as we think of justice, where people might be disempowered by our songs. Disempowered. One of the moments, should I mention the disempowered? Okay. The saints got a little upset when I mentioned this particular instance, but there are ways in which the music, depending on where it's placed in the worship, can act. The music, the choir is like giving me my amen. Depending on where the music is placed in it as a soundscape to what's going on, rituals, communion or whatever, it might actually do the opposite of what we think is going on. There was a viral moment that occurred a couple, maybe 7 years ago now, where there was a installation or ordination of bishops of some sort. Do you know where I'm going? And during this installation, there were some sketchy things that happened, where people just wondered about the sort of inappropriate nature of the ritual, bodies laying on top of bodies. It was untidy to behold, to say the least. It was a lot of questions. And I couldn't help but listen to what was being sung. I give myself away for you to use me. I give myself away. And William, he does some good music, but at that moment, where there needed to be questions, there needed to be consent. They were, I give myself, and they were lost in it. And it's okay. It's okay to be in the spirit. However, was it spirit-led? Because you could be in the spirit. That also brings to mind a moment when I was leading worship at Giant Steps in Chicago. And Giant Steps is a part of the network of churches, a sister church to Trinity. Sean McMillan was a pastor. And there was a moment where he was away, and one of the worship leaders did a song, Everything About You is Right, and then, talking about God, and then he was like, and everything about us is wrong. And everybody opened their eyes, because they were taught that they can interact with the worship leader, and they were like, no, everything about about me is not wrong. No, God, I am fearfully. Like, people started talking, like, casting down stuff. They're like, no, everything about me is not wrong. Of course, we know our righteousness is as filthy rags. We know all of that, but I'm just saying, they were taught to be in theological conversation and active participants. And that same sort of active, critical listening can't help but to trickle into our everyday life, where we are able to hear policy and say, that does not include me. Or we're able to hear lessons and say, that does not include me. It's cultivated in worship. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So I'm going to pause here like I do in class and ask, does anybody have any questions? Or is there anything resonating with anyone that I have said so far? Has anything struck you? Please let me know if there's been something that struck you. Anything at all. Anything. I love the choir. The choir is on my side. I love it. But any thoughts? Anything? Anything? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I'm particularly interested in how racial identity is formed in a lot of our sacred songs. For instance, God took my black soul, dipped it in red blood, and washed me white soul. Now, what does it mean for a group of black worshipers to evoke these ideas about God and Son?
Yeah. And so this is a conversation moment, right? Because immediately when I think of that, there's a corrective that I hear Dean Pollard, y'all know Dean Alton Pollard, he starts his prayers with, thank you, God, for making me black. And thank you, God, for making, and he pauses, and everybody's looking like, ooh, thank you. Like, they're processing. Thank you, God, for making me black. And so, say that was a part of the repertoire schedule for that day. My response as a minister of the gospel, as soon as I got that mic, would be, thank you, God, for making me black. You know? And then after worship, we would go through the inventory of it and find songs that explore the wonder of and beauty of mahogany, blackness. Trinity does a great job of that, even in their motto. And I work with them a lot, so it's coming to my head a lot. There you go. Unashamedly black and unapologetically Christian. Yeah, but this bodaciousness in both the Christianity and blackness. Right. And there are ways in which, even in the African American Heritage Hymnal, where you have the celebration of Kwanzaa. And Kwanzaa, we know, is a commemoration of the principles, right? This is another way to converse with that repertoire. But I suspect many congregations, as they think about it, because I don't hear it often anymore. I don't hear it often, you know, and it could be regionalisms or whatever. But one of the ways to sort of correct it is to look at the occasional music, like for Kwanzaa, and really walk the folks through recitation, through the lyrics. That's another thing about justice. I'm thinking of Richard Smallwood when I asked him, what is he noticing we are lacking in our worship today? He said it's the lack of storytelling. And one of the ways he says we can get back to it is going back to our hymns. And you know, we like to cut out 3 of the 6, but there's a story. And that was the primary way that people got their disciplines within U.S. Christianity. And so getting those hymns back into our spirits is an essential part of our formation. There's so much I want to say. I want to go to Heal Our Land. In many ways, Heal Our Land could be a response to Guide My Feet, or it could be in conversation. And it also builds out our sort of ecological understandings as well. Especially in a time where we're seeing so much friction. This sort of song, which is a beautiful piece, is the sort of song that tells the story And it gives us a layer of morality within our worship. It gives us a layer of values that extend beyond our worship experience. Let's take a listen.
I know.
was a decrescendo, everybody, and staggered breathing. Such skill. I love it. Dr. McNeil. Let's give them a hand clap. I was in a meeting with a colleague of ours, and they were sort of newer to the tradition, and they heard dynamic markings in one of the concerts we attended, and they were like, that's not black gospel. The black gospel is shout and loud and fast. And we were just, you know, with President Ray, we were just like, that's one type, but we got dynamic markings. We can give you some pianissimo. We can give you some of that. And Dr. McNeil gave us some of that tonight, which makes me pivot in the interest of time with regard to personnel. If we're going to do just worship, we need more opportunities to train musicians to have the skills so that they can carry out musical theology. And really and truly, I know that there are various debates about compensation and all of this. And there are various ways in which my friends who are awesome musicians are expected to reserve their talent for sanctuary worship, but there are not ways in which they are empowered to be creative, to get the tools to do so, or to flourish on the outside so they can get the vocabulary to love God with their creativity on the inside of the sanctuary. And so in order to create the sort of theological rigor that matches these awesome theologically rich sermons, we need to start thinking differently about investing in the upbuilding of our music ministers. Amen. 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 As the wonderful soloist was singing, I was thinking of it was Augustine that said, singing is praying twice. And I'm also aware of the ways in which vocalists often don't figure into how people understand the upbuilding of the music ministry, especially women vocalists. They're often the most exploited on many levels, depending on the music ministry. But we, the three of us, do a lot of work with seminaries, with churches, thinking about how to get people those tools so they can respond adequately to the rich sermons that are going forth. And I want to push that even more and say there should be resources in the house so that new music goes forward. Original music of the house. There should be an investment so that the music and the sound that comes out of the sanctuary is distinct and it is God-breathed. If we are spirit-led and we are desiring to be humble and we are desiring to walk rightly and we are equipping the music ministers who are readily helping us to access the presence of God and who are helping to bring people from the margins, there should be a response to the move of the Spirit that is peculiar to the house. So I'm going to ask you a question. How are we learning our music for worship? Is it through the radio? Through streaming? How are we learning the music? How are we learning it? Yeah, people are like, yeah, through the radio, through streaming. Newsbreak, and here I'm thinking of my friend Daniel Moore. He says, as a producer for shows like Sunday Best, he says that when people come to audition for Sunday Best, they get a list of about 100 songs to audition for a show that's supposed to be about gospel music, black sacred music. And people always criticize them and say, why does everybody sing Amazing Grace and Yes, Jesus Loved Me and all of that? And he said, well, because people are learning their music from the radio. And the radio broadcasters today are relying on algorithms as opposed to curatorship. And so the music that they're hearing is not from, it's only from 2000 onward. And so literally in the production of the show, they are offering public arts education. Like, they're being introduced to the Winans, the Caravans, Reverend Shirley Caesar on the show. And they're actually not learning the musical textures, let alone the lyrics, but the chordal changes are like our musical salvation for many of them in production. Like, they're being introduced to this. And so we have to dust off some things. You know, this is the sort of tricky part of worship as commodity, when worship is being bought and sold through recordings, through concerts, through the tastes of the public. We are actually losing a layer of developing musical skills for the people. And I want to also offer that there, you know, when we talk about the quality of the worship, there's this criticism of the repetition in music. But in this song, I thought that the repetition came at the appropriate moment when you've already communicated a story, right? We're already building up a case for, in this instance, justice. And so when you get to the Heal Our Land, it becomes a seal. You don't start off with the seal at the beginning of the worship. Like you don't seal wood without some color under it, some primer, some another layers of color. Then you seal it. Does that make sense? And so I don't want to do away with repetition, because repetition is supposed to make firm what has been established. And so the designing of worship is an important part of the sort of equipping that we need to offer our musicians, so they understand the art of storytelling that is offered to them in their religious life through hymns, listening to the hymns, discussing the hymns. In the true Methodist way, I believe you have both the hymn and the Bible together, right? Your musical life and your written life together. I want to go ahead, I see the time is late, and I want to go to Lift Every Voice and Sing, appropriately selected for this night, because we are celebrating the 120th anniversary of its composition by James Weldon Johnson. And this song has an interesting history. Of course, we can read several books on the song. The most recent and most award-winning is Imani Perry's book, May We Forever Stand. And what we learned is that initially this song was supposed to be an ode to Abraham Lincoln. But as James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson got together on this song, it took on an epic feel in a way that has made it almost a repertoire unto itself. There is not another song that is regarded in the same way for African Americans across religious traditions, like Lift Every Voice and Sing. And so if you are at an interfaith service, say with the Nation of Islam, for example, or with Black Jews, or a Jewish community here, I know a lot of my Jewish friends who know this song. It is a sort of song that sonically brings people in, and the poetry is worth memorizing. And of course, I'm from the school where you memorize it, and that's your street credibility. Like, if you don't know the words to Lift Every Voice and Sing, that's the time for a restroom break, because people are going to watch you. They're going to watch you as you follow Christ and sing Lift Every Voice and Sing. So people call it a hymn, people call it an anthem. This is one of the songs that I typically use to talk about performance practice. There are ways that you do this song that are not in the African American Heritage Hymnal. Amen? Amen. There are ways that you slow down, that you linger, that are not in the hymnal. And that matters because when we're talking about oral transmission of music, there are only aspects of the music that you learn through community. And so as folks are trying to do this sort of interfaith and intercultural thing, do it in community. Make sure you're in conversation with people of various identities so that these traditions can be shared, and so folks won't get anxious as we are welcomed into their spaces and as they come into ours. So Lift Every Voice. Which rendition are we doing this evening? congregation, especially if they are a native son or daughter of the area. Roland Carter interpreted the Johnson piece, but it almost is as popular as its original. Let's take a listen. Many of you know it. feel like we were just having a recital. It's nothing like seeing Roland Carter conduct it too. You know, it's interesting to have also the composer come in to do clinics with the congregation. Yes, I'd be curious to know of your experiences with that. Lift Every Voice and Sing to me was one of the greatest gifts that DC Public Schools gave to me. Learning the verses to that song, to me, the mark of a good culturally relevant education. And of course, we cannot rely on schools alone to give that education, and I think instilling this sort of repertoire is important. I know that we have one other selection, and here I want to draw attention to a core value that I know guides my work, and I think many believers have this sort of value, and I evoke it here as a reminder for what should be the intention behind justice in our worship, being equitable, being fair, being mindful, inclusive in the sense that we bring people from the margins. And Lift Every Voice and Sing gives us this sort of collective imagination, this sort of dignity. Imani Perry calls it this black formalism. It's almost anthem-like in the way that it is performed. And historically, if we know the stories of this song as a resource, this song would be interchanged with the Battle Hymn of the Republic, often in historically black colleges and universities, right? So often you get that taught to you at the same time. But this song is also the mark of repertoire for the traditions of the Fish Jubilee singers, right? The music that, when we talk about commodity, the sort of music that was used to raise funds for education. And so talking about these stories of how music is a technology, it's a resource, it's more than a commodity. It has been able to be a lifeline for us so that we can have uplift. These sorts of stories are important to bring into the prayers and to the longings of the people. But my hope, the value that I want to call us to remember is that they will know we are Christians by our love. They will know we are Christians by our love. Yes, they will know we are Christians by our love. There are many ways I can get into the details, the gradations of how justice could be brought into worship, how we can dismantle oppressive rituals. However, the final thought I want to leave with you is, how do we make the decisions about what we include apart from love? How do we make sure that all of our efforts demonstrate a care and hospitality for the sonic lives of the people that come into our church? It should not all rest on the preacher. Traditionally, in African-derived religious expression for us here in the U.S., there's been a coupling of rhetoric and music. Rhetoric and music. And so, even more so now, how can we think about designing the message that complements what the preacher is doing? Yes. But we know that there is a technology in the music that remains even after people leave. And so this final song that we have here, we envisioned it almost as a benediction, almost as ascending. And we think that it's a very relevant message that could be used in an interfaith setting, drawing from Andre Crouch, who is a foreparent in the sort of praise and worship movements that we associate with the West Coast in the 80s and 90s and the Jesus Peoples movement. His music, like the Hoggins or just Smallwood, has this sort of sonic texture that often when folks born after 2000 encounter it, it's this sort of lush experience that I observed as I shared with them. And so I hope that we revisit these musics. And so this is what we want to leave you with in closing. As you leave Wednesday Bible study, noontime Bible study where there is road rage, and you have this being overlaid into your spirit. Imagine this as you encounter all sorts of tensions in your worship and in your work. This sort of message to me is the sort of the seal that I'm talking about earlier. That repetition that works after you have a story.